Good morning from Toronto, which is where I am today. My name is Dimitri Soudas. I am the Vice President of Selection Group and also the Chairman of Lethal Resources. Also, in a previous life, I spent more than a decade serving the Prime Minister of Canada as his Director of Communications, Chief Spokesman, and Strategic Advisor. So today, it is my pleasure to moderate a roundtable discussion about the cybersecurity landscape and the cybersecurity issues faced by corporations, governments, and citizens alike. So what happens if questions about cybersecurity are left unposed? Before I go any further, I need to note that the views expressed by all of us here today are our views alone and don't necessarily reflect the views of the organizations that we represent. So let me start by saying welcome to those who are attending by webcast. And I would like to quickly move and introduce our subject matter experts. First, Matt Hayden. Matt is the Assistant Secretary to Cyber Infrastructure, Risk, and Resilience Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Not a pair of shoes that I would want to be in. In this role, Mr. Hayden manages, directs, and coordinates development of department-wide cyber infrastructure risk and resilience policies, and he's also responsible for administering the policy development process. Additionally, Mr. Hayden serves as an expert advisor to the Undersecretary, the Secretary, and other high-level U.S. government officials. So thank you for joining us, Matt. Second, Ghonche Alavi. She is a senior consultant at Crisis 24, which is a Garda World company. Ghonche is an experienced information and network security advisor and certified digital forensic examiner. And for those who don't know the term, she is also an ethical hacker. Thank you again, Ghonche. Next is Kris Lovejoy. Kris is world-renowned in cybersecurity risk compliance and governance. Kris leads EY Global Advisory Cybersecurity Services, and she regularly keynotes at RSA, InfoSec, and Security World conferences, as well as appearing on publications such as Forbes, Fortune, SC Magazine, InfoWorld, and USA Today. Next is Thierry Dassault. Mr. Dassault is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Groupe Industriel, Marcel Dassault, which is a France-based group of companies established in 1929 at emerging technologies and niche sectors, which hold stakes in Aquarelle, Bernardo, Blablacar, and many others. And finally, Chen. Stephen is a serial entrepreneur who founded 4 companies. He is now the founder and chief executive officer of PFP Cybersecurity, which is a US-based cybersecurity solution provider. And Stephen is also an investor of more than 30 cybersecurity companies. It's great to have you all, and thank you for lending both your expertise and your experience on this very important topic. So let's kick it off with a boilerplate question. Why do we actually need to worry about information security? And what are the biggest cybersecurity threats right now? Any one of you, jump in. Kris.
We're all super polite, so thank you for volunteering me. So let me simplify. So for those of you who are coming at this subject a little bit new, when I, as a practitioner, think about cybersecurity, I'm thinking about it within the context of a risk formula. And the way it works is, if there's a threat out there that's a bad person, group of people, piece of malware out in the wild, and that can exploit a vulnerability, which is a gap in somebody's knowledge or a lack of a patch, but whatever the case may be, and create an impact, which could be a disruption of service, could be theft of data, et cetera, then there's a cyber risk. And my job is to decrease the opportunity for the threat actor to get in, decrease the number of vulnerabilities that can be exploited, or address the impact. And in today's world, if you think about where we are post-COVID, we've done about 10 years of innovation in 1 year. And so what's happened is we have a whole lot of technology that's available to consumers and others that is largely been thrown out there with no security control. So from a exploitable surface, the surface has increased quite a bit. From a threat actor perspective, you have to recognize that it is a very economically driven industry. The bad guys recognize that there's a huge opportunity to perpetrate fraud and other kinds of cyber crime. They're recognizing they just get a lot more, value for the buck that they spend on cyber nowadays. And so the threats are becoming more sophisticated, more organized. And as a result, we're seeing more disruption. We're seeing more ransomware attacks, et cetera. And so it's kind of a perfect storm where threats are increasing, vulnerabilities are expanding, impacts are increasing. And so just statistically, it is a very important risk area for us to be focusing on because of all of these various variables that I was describing.
Thank you. Stephen, did you want to jump in on that?
Sure, thank you. I think the security boundary has changed, right? 10 years ago, we assumed adversaries or the bad guys are outside the firewall, and inside the firewall we're secure, we're safe. And now the boundary has been broken. The adversary could be around us at your home, in your office, through supply chains, through network, and our data now is stored outside the firewall. And this COVID-19 has changed the boundary again, right? So now it's the threat could be everywhere, and we also extend it outside the boundary, make it more vulnerable.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to the next question, and maybe we'll start with Matt, but I'd love to hear all of your views on this one. So many say that one of the biggest challenges in information security is what we call information asymmetry, where basically one side has more information than the other. And right now, at least perception is that the bad guys are very good at sharing information. So what are the key success factors for the good guys to be more open to the idea of sharing information and security amongst themselves more than the bad guys do? So Matt, if you want to lead us off on this, but I'd love to hear everybody's views on this one.
Absolutely. And I'll also touch on the first question a little bit. I mean, part of the challenge we have is also the resilience on and the dependence on a lot of these information systems that just 5-10 years ago weren't the case. We're relying on data models to help us in our decision making all the way through multiple layers of private sector and government. And to have that vulnerable is a large challenge and something to definitely put energy towards. With regards to the information sharing challenge and how do we combat the good versus bad or the red versus blue conversation, the big challenge we have is making sure there's not stigmas around vulnerability disclosure. One of the challenges that comes before our department is, hey, we're here with the government, we're here to help. And that's a hard sentence to say in a lot of these communities. When we talk to security researchers and we want to embolden them to be trustful with us, to say, hey, if you found a vulnerability that has a critical impact, let us work and string together a team of folks to take a look at this, and let's bring together whole sector efforts so that this vulnerability doesn't impact others. And that has been a large product that's come from the newly formed CISA last year, is that convening of like-minded good guys, if you will, just to really get an idea of where this vulnerability exists, how it can be mitigated, and to better inform the population at large. I think that there's always a better job that can be done, but we're really leaning in the seat to make sure that we get that information sharing as well as, and that's not just speaking to threats, it's speaking to just what we know from each other and to make sure that's in each other's hands.
Thanks, Matt. Ghonche, you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, and I think it's such an important question. When it comes to information asymmetry, I think, as mentioned, a lot of it is down to the stigma. Companies are afraid of the crisis comms perspective of coming out and admitting that they were indeed vulnerable. We find that it's most successful when we work with the crisis management teams and are actually liaising directly with law enforcement agencies and intelligence services, the cyber threat intelligence community. There are so many resources to support organizations when they do become victim to these sorts of incidents. And using those resources is so important and underdone. Unfortunately, we don't see enough of it. And part of my role is actually encouraging and facilitating those discussions because when it comes to crisis management, you need as much intel on the threat actor, their modus operandi, the indicators of compromise. All of this is so important and will inform your strategy for recovery. So the information asymmetry, I think, is still based on stigma, but I think as we allow organizations to come forward, in part in an anonymized fashion, it definitely helps facilitate information sharing.
Thank you. Thierry, what's your perspective on the bad guys being better than the good guys right now at sharing information?
Yes, everybody now knows the name of ransomware. Ransomware, the problem is for the people who work in the company and maybe by inadvertence will open and attach a piece of a mail and the disaster is beginning. So the bad guys can be inside also, because you can have, like we'll see in the bank Desjardins, Mouvement Desjardins in Montreal, an employee will take a lot of information. What I think is to avoid the key USB on the PC. It's very important to don't have more, because with a key you can put a virus or you can take a lot of information.
Kris?
Yeah, I would, as I'm listening, I would agree with everything everyone said. I think there is, I'm just going to turn this to the flip side and put on my cynical hat, because I've been in this industry for, 30 years. When you're protecting your organization, you need to think about it as if you're protecting your home. And when you're protecting your home, you live in different neighborhoods, you have different things that you value. There are different threat actors that, have different ways of getting into the home depending on how it's built. So when you're sharing information, context is important. It is really important for you to have good connections with peers within similar industries that are facing similar threats. I have on occasion been given information that has been bad information and acted on that information because I was doing it in the thinking that the person with whom I was communicating was giving me, sort of correct guidance, just wasn't. So it's just very important in this particular industry because it's easy to believe the news. It's harder to put on that cynical hat, as I said, and really think through, what is it that I need to worry about? Find those people with whom you can get that information.
Thanks. Stephen, I want to lead with you on the next question. Obviously, governance, boards of directors, senior management teams grapple with this issue. And many of them, they ask, what do I need to know? But more importantly, what is it that I need to ask? So as they're getting briefed, whether they are the audit committee or the risk management committee, they don't know if they're asking the right questions. Because at the end of the day, members of a corporate board aren't subject matter experts, but they have a certain level of accountability. So maybe, Stephen, you can lead us off on this round and maybe provide some tips. What are the right questions to be asking, both in terms of planning for cyber threats, but also crisis management should a cyber threat or a cyber breach occur, which is going to lead me to the next question after that.
Sure. I think a lot of time is the cultural, right? So the barrier is still the cultural and will not be encouraged to bring up the issue. So I will say the first question, is do we have the culture to encourage openness, sharing, and instead of, hey, if I don't know, I'm not liable. So I will say that's the first question I will ask.
Great. Matt, from a government perspective, maybe you can pick up the ball on this question. And how can government, quite frankly, better educate the private sector, but also, everyday average citizens on the right questions to ask so that they can be better prepared?
And I would just champion a lot of what Kris said when we opened up. A lot of it's knowing where your risk lies, and to also champion that the culture is a big part of that. And it's not just the culture of reporting; it's the culture of change. So, for example, if we come to a position in which there is something that needs to be fixed, or if we have a culture in a workplace or even within the government in which our posture isn't to truly protect those items that we think are risk, the highest crown jewels, if you will, that have the greatest risk of disruption or if they get compromised, that's where the leadership needs to lean in. And that's where we learn that we can have these conversations with C-suite partners and the leadership and corporations. And it's a different tone. When we talk to the American public, there's a think before you click type of mentality. You're thinking about the ransomware implications and the broader perspective of the one-on-one between a user and their keyboard. But we do need to talk to boards in a different tone and to improve the communication they have with what the government's expecting from them as a member of our supply chain, as a member of our community, as a member of our sector, so that they know that when we come to them with a cybersecurity issue, we're dependent on that board to have that level of accountability for culture change and for accountability for high-risk assets.
Kris, what do you think?
I could go on all day on this subject. So I do a lot of work with boards and in transforming sort of their approach to this. I mean, let's be realistic. It's a scary subject, talking about cybersecurity. I think one of the worst things that a board can do is invest cybersecurity expertise in one individual. I get that question a lot. Should we have a cyber expert on the board? It's good to have a cyber expert on the board, but not if it means that the rest of the board is going to think it's not their responsibility. That's not okay. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to sort of board oversight, you have to recognize that most businesses today, when they embark on a digital transformation, only about 30 to 40% of those transformations, let's say it's an ERP transformation, they will bring security in after the fact, after it's been designed, not necessarily built, but it's been designed. That's when they bring the security guys in with the checklist. So from an oversight perspective, where can a board have a lot of value is asking a very simple question up front. When anybody brings initiative is digitally enabled to the board, ask the question, where's cyber? What's the cyber risk? What do I need to worry about? It's a very simple thing. And then the third thing I would say just in closing is one of the other areas where a board can offer huge amounts of value is in helping establish the risk tolerance for the chief security officer. I, as a chief security officer, I don't know how much is enough. Business needs to tell me what the risk appetite is so that I have something to work for. Oftentimes, we're kind of floating out in the wind. We have no idea how much is enough. We could build perfect security, but somebody has to give us the guardrails. That's the job of the board, is to establish that risk appetite. So I'd say from an oversight perspective, that's one of the first areas where they can jump in as well.
Thierry, from your perspective, with decades of experience and real life experience in corporate boards, how have things evolved, and what are the questions that you're asking today that maybe you weren't asking 10 or 15 years ago?
Well, what I can say by experience that responsible of security in the company is I say in French, Chateau Fort. So, everything. You don't want to have some security logiciel who he can't manage. Can you imagine? He can think that if we put this logiciel, he will be a spy. Yes, spy. And so I don't want. For the board, I can confess that this subject is not very actually, but I think maybe it changed. It's not very speak in the board, because, as I say, the responsible of the security is the chief of chief, and we see that there is some damage more often because he can manage everything, and there is some good company who can do the work. So
Great.
We have to change the mentality.
Thank you. So real life situation, cybersecurity, crisis management planning. And I'd love to hear from all of you on this one, because there's more than one door and more than one option. So what do you do? Have you planned out the worst case scenario? Do you pay the ransom? Where do you go and get Bitcoin? Do you negotiate with the hackers, or do you take the hard line? What is your plan either way? And something as basic as, do you actually have access to cryptocurrency? Maybe Ghonche, you can lead us off on this one. But there's more than one road that leads to Rome on this question.
Sure, absolutely. So, when it comes to crisis management, it is very much grounded in organizational resilience. When you're looking at crisis management planning, you have to have anticipated in advance, looked at the threats, done sort of horizon scanning. Then you're looking at all of the processes and plans that you need to put in place, testing those, making sure that you've got the right people in the right positions. So if you're putting together a cyber incident response team, they have the right skill set, both from a technical perspective, but also liaising with the wider crisis management organization. Then it's the actual response bit. And that's the bit where I think I see a lot of times when I'm coming in as a cyber incident responder, where not enough has been done by way of testing those plans. They might have something on paper. I've seen it time and time again when it relates specifically to disaster recovery planning, when all of it is stored on the cloud that is now inaccessible to them. So all of that preparatory work should come out as part of the anticipation phase. When it relates to ransom payments, to pay, not to pay, it is a very difficult decision to make. I think it's easy to take a moral high ground, but when it is your business, when it's your livelihood and your employees' livelihood at risk, unfortunately, clients do find themselves in a position where they feel there is no choice. And navigating that really difficult process, you're going to need some support there. I was on a case earlier this year in Europe where a new malware variant had been used. All of the systems had been encrypted. The data had been wiped, and part of the logs had also been wiped. So not only did they not have access, but they also had lost a lot of the forensic evidence as well. How do you compete with something like that? How do you get your data back? And we did support them, of course, in the negotiation. You don't just pay a ransom. You've got to make sure that the threat actor has the intent and the capability to get you your data back. The onus is on them to demonstrate that. And we do a lot of tests, a lot of checks to make sure that the decryption key that they do give us. But to the point that we made earlier about information sharing, I've also been on cases where they've taken a hard line, we're not going to pay. And linking in with law enforcement, they have databases of decryption tools. So reaching out to other stakeholders that could potentially support you on this is important if you are going to take that hardline stance.
Maybe I want to go back to Matt before we continue with Stephen. Matt, and obviously not talking about anything specific, but on the government side, how do you plan for crisis management when the government gets hacked?
So, and going a little sensitive on this one, the government has to do a lot of tabletop exercises.
It's just between us. I promise.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. No, nothing there. So, for example, with our current situation, when we have indicators of compromise, we as a government fall back to our processes that we've done a good bit of tabletop exercising around and role play kind of how this would happen. What if this service is no longer available? What if this data is exfiltrated? And basically follow that playbook. We have standards in place for if there's a certain threshold of compromise, what the next level up is. And so that level of planning is involved. One of the good news stories here, though, especially when it comes to vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities with the government, is that the relationship we have with the private sector has evolved so much in the past few years, to the extent where it may not be from one of our intelligence partners or the ISE partners that let us know about this vulnerability. It may be a security researcher firm. It may be an anonymous tip. It also may be one of our private sector partners that's a service provider. And it's to those multiple service providers that really lean in the saddle and tell us, look, you've got a problem on your networks. We're letting you know. We're here to talk with you about this response package. And that's how we get out disclosures like we did this week, in which we had joint sealed products going out saying, hey, we've got a problem on our networks. Here's what we're doing to fix it. everyone else learn from this. At the same time, doing that crisis management where we have key senior leaders speaking on this, just say, hey, look, this is something that isn't avoidable no matter the steps you take, because when you look at supply chain and the efforts, we want to make sure you're prepared when and if this incident happens so that you have a proper playbook, that you do know who to contact and how to operate.
U.S. government position, do you negotiate with hackers?
The U.S. government does not. We don't pay ransomware. The challenge that we have is specifically here in the States, the ransomware payments are as they get attributed and linked to significant nation state actors or others that are on national sanctions lists, it actually becomes a bigger challenge to even make that payment in a lawful manner. And so from the government's perspective, from a ransomware incident, we do not.
Stephen, maybe we can have you close up this round as it relates to crisis management planning and paying ransomware, negotiating with hackers or not.
I have to admit that I have not dealt with ransomware situation, and we do have.
But have you planned for it?
I think it's really case by case. It's difficult to have a guideline, a general for, we invest in 50 some companies. Some of them got hacked for different things. And, so the lessons learned is really, hey, don't just count on your in-house cyber talent, because many of the companies we invest in, they have limited amount of resources, right? Even they are cyber experts. That doesn't mean that they put their attention to their internal infrastructure. So I agree with everything said. You need to have a playbook because it's almost impossible to not be hacked in today's environment. And at the same time, you need to have ongoing monitoring. Usually we recommend from outsider, and we also have a group of company who can help instant response. But it's really difficult to say, hey, there's one size for all.
Kris, would love to have you lead the next round. And really, let's look at it from an investor's point of view. What do investors want to know about cybersecurity, both preparedness and crisis management, before they decide to commit to investing either in a new venture or any business transaction? So how do investors react to cybersecurity preparedness or lack of?
It's a fantastic question. I think that, a few years back, I would have had to have said they didn't. It wasn't even on the radar screen. I think it's an emerging topic of concern. I think the more advanced PE, VC funds in particular are beginning to incorporate cybersecurity privacy protection into the due diligence process. It's kind of a well-known fact that there's this window, the time from which you announce an intention to acquire and then transfer of trade. There's this window where all of a sudden it's like, flies on a piece of birthday cake. The attackers just recognize that, in preparation for sale, you've cut back on pretty much everything you possibly can from an operations perspective. You've got everything going into sales and marketing. And so therefore, because you've cut back on ops, you don't quite have as much security control as you would already have. The attackers know it is the perfect time to begin to swamp that organization, try to get inside, it's not necessarily to get the IP, but to get a foothold, so that when the larger organization digests the smaller organization, what they're doing is they're incorporating malware, they're incorporating the bad actor who's using it as a staging point, as a Trojan horse, for entering into the bigger. So, having sort of seen a lot of this when I was the CISO at IBM, just again and again and again, it was that one window. And so what I would say is that, for anybody who's going through a due diligence process, it is critical that you are looking at key controls, particularly around the crown jewels of the organization, whether that be IP, whether that be data. Also keep in mind that there could be, sort of embedded logic bonds, ransomware, other that the bad guys are looking to ingest or to sort of get into your organization. So it is critical that you do adequate pen testing, vulnerability assessments, maturity assessments, just to understand what it is that you're acquiring before you take it in.
So this is really newsworthy. So what you're saying basically is during that due diligence period, exposure is extremely high. So how do you run your due diligence process with, quite frankly, not only by mitigating, but to try and eliminate that exposure? Do you create a parallel process, a parallel server? Like for me, this is news as a business person. That exposure is so big during a due diligence period. Oh yeah, well, no, it's part of the process. So it is part of the process, but there are a couple of tricks. I mean, there's also, when you think about the holdback, you want to think about the holdback for cyber issues. You want to make sure that you're adequately protected when it comes to sort of IP protection and the pre-existence of malware within that organization. So there are contractual legal things that you can consider in addition to doing the due diligence. One of the other things that I've seen is some organizations will actually blanket the organization. They'll actually pay for, or the PE or the VC will pay for additional security control around that organization prior to the letter of intent being signed. So there are some things that you can do, but there are organizations, come to us, come to others. There are organizations out there that can help you in deciphering what you need to do. It doesn't have to be terribly expensive, but there are the trade. Ghonche, did you want to jump in on this from the perspective of Garda World and how you guys and girls view the perspective of basically investors being much more interested in cybersecurity today than what they were 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd echo a lot of what Kris has just said. I think one of the most important things you can do is to make sure that you are doing your deep and dark web monitoring during that process. The last thing you want is any information getting out, any IP getting out, having the sort of ring fencing the most critical IP. And I think it becomes increasingly important to use the same security framework, the risk assessment framework that you have. So it's a comparable like for like. I see so many different maturity models and matrices set up and people apply it in different ways. If you use a standard framework across organizations, then you really know what you're facing. And that score, what does that actually mean in relation to where your maturity is at? So I would say definitely additional monitoring and the risk assessment process, being really thorough with that, but before any disclosure.
Stephen, you're an investor. You've invested in more than 30 cybersecurity companies, but I'm sure you've also invested in other companies. As an investor, what reassurances do you seek in order to invest in some of these projects that you've engaged in?
Yeah, so we in general would like to see a score. There are many tools out there or service provider out there do a score ranking of the company. Another thing, I learned through one of our investment is they provide scan on dark web for companies as part of the due diligence for potential investors, right? So, the ranking might be good, but there might be some information on dark web could potentially present a risk. And yeah, so we usually would like to see as a minimum of those type of things.
Thierry, to close it up.
Yes, for me, I invest in new technology. I was in the PKI, Public Key Infrastructure, in 2004. And 9 years ago, I invest in Walix. Walix is a company who detects the intrusion, non-solicited. For me, it's a good question to know if I put money in this company, if it's not in the security. Is well protected, but well protected is for me few months because the pirate will take advantage and put new attack frequently. So what I think it's to test the red as a company, to inform the employee once a year minimum, or 2? Because it's very simple to be attacked if there is some problem inside with, as I say, with the mail or the thing, or you won $100 and click there, or we have to pay for you something. So we have this on the internet, but we have this now in the SMS on the phone. Every day I have some strange message. Huh? We have to be very careful.
And it's one of the last questions I will ask on this issue. Matt, I want to come back to you. I really found it interesting what Kris said as it relates to a due diligence period and how an organization is most vulnerable during that due diligence period. Another word for due diligence in government terms is transition. So currently in the United States, there's a new administration that is getting briefed up and getting ready to take over in January. So during this due diligence period, Matt, how does the U.S. government ensure that the bad guys aren't putting in their Trojan horses as this transition happens?
Well, the good news is that the career staff that make up a large portion of our government isn't actually transitioning. It's the leadership, it's the key roles for decision makers. So the watchers and the implementers of our operational planning and preparation are lockstep and ready to take on a lot of the challenges that do come during this truly sensitive period. The challenges are basically you have two sets of decision makers at that point. You have the current administration and their decision point, and then you have the education of the incoming decision makers and senior leaders to make sure they're up to speed as these decisions are being made. And so that's where that sensitivity comes in, is that decision-making process and the correct information getting to kind of the multiple stakeholders at the top. And so we're very sensitive to the nature of, especially with the recent compromise information out and the challenges that we're undergoing as a government, at the same time making sure that both current leaders as well as future leaders are up to speed and ready to hit the ground running as they come in the door. One of the other challenges I'd highlight is that the recent challenges we're coming across, as well as have been notified in the past, coming back to your previous question about investment and that window of time, it's not just the individuals and the corporations themselves, is that entirety of the supply chain. It's the who you're hosting your platform with, who your products connect to, and having that. And when it comes to those individuals that may be looking to get business contracts or work with the government as a vendor, we're trying to do better on our risk assessment needs as that cascades down the supply chain as well.
Thanks, Matt. Ghonche, maybe I want to lead the next round with you. What's an ethical hacker? Because the question is really going to be about, do we just play defense or do we also play offense? Do we hack the hackers? Do we go after them? Or do we just wait until they've succeeded and we're into crisis management? So maybe, Ghonche, you can tell us a little bit about what an ethical hacker is. And then I'd really love to hear everybody's perspective on whether we should be going much more on the offense on this issue.
Great question again. So definitely as an ethical hacker, I would say, threat hunting, going out there to understand what is out in the wild, how is it evolving, and what the threat landscape is like. You've got to stay in touch with that. And the only way you do that is through ethical hacking. Now, of course, for organizations on the prevention consulting side, so aside from the response that we provide, it's really looking at where are your gaps. We get a lot of cyber threat intelligence. You hear about changing MOs. You might even get IOCs shared with you. A whole lot of information is out there, but how does that specifically relate to you? And it goes back to what Kris was saying about the vulnerability assessment. You've got to do penetration testing that is checking your systems, your data, and your network, but also it's the vulnerability assessment from a people perspective. Going back to the point about having a security culture in place, the amount of times, I've done pen testing where they've come up great, and then I've walked through the office, I've walked through the site, and I've seen, bad behaviors, whether that's passwords written on Post-it notes on the table, whether it's, no clear desk policy, everything just being out in the open. It's the combination of the two, really. It's the technical and the non-technical that gives you a real understanding of where your exposure is at. So pen testing, definitely important. Hacking, definitely important. But it only gives you a snapshot view of the organization. You've got to do it it's got to be a much more holistic approach to security for it to be effective.
And do we wait at our own blue line, Ghonche, or do we try and score a goal once in a while? I think that most of us don't really understand that we shouldn't just be waiting. What do we do to go on the offense, and do we go on the offense?
I mean, it depends who you're asking. As an ethical hacker, of course, I would say a little bit of offense. I remember when I was first getting trained up for the hacking, it was the first thing my instructor told me is there's no such thing as a white hat hacker. You will always be a little bit gray. But ultimately, I think going on the offense, I think for depending on the level of the organization, I think increasingly with states, you see, I mean, it's across the world, everybody's on the offense. I don't think anyone's really on the defense. But I think it's important to understand how the threat landscape is changing, and it's complex, and you can't do that without crossing some lines sometimes.
Kris?
I'm not on the crossing lines side of the fence. I'm sorry. So true story, a few years back, huge breach in the news. CEO, I don't know why, but it was one of those, like my cousin's son's girlfriend works in a cyber company, so they had them come in and do a sort of an assessment. They came back and said, "Oh, you've been hacked by the Chinese, and here's the IP addresses, and you should go attack these actors." So they bring me bring my team, and we didn't do offensive work, but they wanted us to just look at it. It turned out they were Google ad servers. So this idiot group had given them a bunch of IP addresses that were associated with Chinese Google ad servers. They wanted to go ahead and attack them. Now, I just point this out because this was actually a huge company and the CEO of a huge company that was advocating going out and attacking Google because they didn't know any better. Now, I know that this seems silly, but this happens. Attribution in this world is incredibly hard. Leave it to Matt, leave it to DHS, leave it to the nation state. We have no business on the commercial side hacking anybody. Trust me, we don't know. What you read in the news is not what's happening. And I'm sure Matt is laughing because he knows that what's happening in the news today is not correct. So what you're reading is not you're not seeing what's happening. So please, for the love of God, do not think about offensive security yourself. This is something you want to call Matt, please call Matt. But do not take this on yourself without some sort of nation state behind you.
And I'd just like to clarify, I absolutely agree. I'm not advocating for private organizations to go out there and hack. It's really just to get information, not to actually dark web monitoring, that threat intelligence, just to be super, super clear.
So Kris, thank you, Ghonche. So Kris, you've made more news today. You've confirmed that I've heard somebody in the United States, not sure who, has tagged this term called fake news. So there is a little bit of that as well. So we have to be cognizant of that. Stephen, and again, going after the bad guys. Obviously, governments and states are focusing on that, which is why I'm going to leave Matt as the last one to answer this question. What's your perspective on that, Stephen?
Yeah, I agree with Kris. The offensive stuff is at higher level on the government side. The commercial will stay with defense.
Matt, so tell us all about the offense that takes place at DHS and how everybody else in the private sector should leave it to government.
So, for starters, yes, offensive operations with state actors is the level that I think is the international norm at the moment. I don't think there's any question that it needs to go in any other direction just because the diplomacy rate needs to be able to have that red phone ring just in case. So, to the extent that that's there, I'll also highlight that in our experience, before even speaking of offense, we have a large job ahead of us purely in defense. When we start looking at where that balance is, we're still trying to get corporations to include two-factor authentication. We're still trying to get some of these baseline cyber hygiene practices out there. So before some of the more advanced options become kind of the shiny bauble to try and retaliate or take aggressive measures, we're in the same boat as was highlighted before. Like our dollars are going into threat hunting. Our dollars are going into monitoring service. We're looking, especially when we talk about our CISA organization, as the services we can provide to those, even in state and local. So, for example, a small mayor or township that just may not have the resources. What can we provide as services to up their defense so that we can make sure that if there is an activity against them, that they have the most level of notification and protection that whole of government approach can apply. So I think I could leave it with that. But we also would want to champion that the security researchers, the ethical hackers, the white hat hackers have been a great resource to the government. The U.S. government has a relationship that goes several years, at least with my tenure here. And it includes us handing over hardware to those that know candidly more than we do and saying, have at it, see where our security is, and give us that report because we're going to use it. And that's a useful tool we would never want to take away.
Thanks, Matt. So we have about 2 minutes left. So I want to wrap up our conversation with everybody simply giving, what do you do in your daily lives as citizens that ensures that your data, your information, your smart TV, everything you do that, everything we do today involves something digital. So I would love to hear, and I think everybody watching right now would love to hear from subject matter experts, what is it that you do to protect yourselves and your families? And maybe we'll start with Thierry.
So it's very simple. You put off all the TV, the device, and so you are quiet because we can't know for the attack at the day. Today, tomorrow, if there is an attack, you will know the attack when the ransomware will send you a message to be paid, or they block the server. So it's quite difficult. It's a very good question because everything is now connected, and you know the object IoT. You know the car who sends some information, and a few years ago, some journalists take the control of the car. Okay, there is no accident, but this is the problem. IoT.
Thank you. Stephen, 30 seconds for you.
Yeah, with the supply chain being weaponized, with many things being connected, I wouldn't trust anything around me. You have to assume, the TV, if there's a camera, someone could be watching you. And most of people don't believe how bad it could be, right? It's really much worse.
What are the I think we'd all really love to hear about the one or two things that each of you does to add a certain extra layer of security.
For non-technical people, I ask my kids to frequently reboot their phone and turn off, cover their camera on their computer. Don't plug in anything they don't need to. Turn off their PC when they go to bed. Right, very simple stuff. Don't click on anything they shouldn't click on.
Thank you.
It's just a habit.
Thank you, Kris.
I take the opposite. I dive into technology. I adopt everything I possibly can. I try it out. I explore it, try to figure out what the risks are. But if I don't understand it, there's no way I'm going to be able to advocate any kind of improvement.
Got it. Ghonche?
Definitely avoid public Wi-Fi, password managers, and privacy screens.
So you memorize every single one of your passwords?
No. I use the password manager.
Got it. Okay, using password managers. Perfect. And finally, Matt, when you're not wearing your DHS hat and you're back home with your family, what are those small things you tell them? Because we'd love to hear from you more than anybody else.
Updates. If there's a patch, implement it. If there's some alert, make sure you subscribe to that when you buy that new camera and it says, would you like to hear from us? Yes. Not only is it a challenge because they may send you sales information, but you need to know, you need to be on their mailing list when they say there's an update and you need it. So patch management for all those toys, for all those devices, TVs, phones, and the like.
Thank you. So this wraps up our session. We went 90 seconds above the planned time. I hope that watching enjoyed this conversation. I certainly did. I'm throwing out my laptop today and I'm going to go buy a typewriter. So Matt, Ghonche, Kris, Thierry, and Stephen, thank you to all of you for participating in this panel. Wishing everybody watching the panel, but also to the 5 of you, happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and we'll see you next time.